No one warned her what would happen after the songs ended. The torches were still burning when the laughter faded. Wine cups lay overturned on marble floors. The guests, men in white togas, women draped in crimson veils, had already begun to leave, their sandals echoing down the stone corridors of the domus. To the world outside, the wedding of a Roman citizen was a moment of celebration, law, and order. But inside the house, as the door was bolted shut, another Rome revealed itself. A Rome that did not write its rituals down. A Rome that survived through silence. The bride stood alone, her face hidden beneath the flammeum, the traditional orange-red veil meant to symbolize fire, fertility, and obedience. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from knowledge passed in whispers between women who never spoke loudly enough to be overheard by men. Every Roman girl knew the saying. A bride enters the marriage crying, or not at all. Marriage in ancient Rome was not built on love. It was a contract. A transaction between families. A transfer of authority. One moment, the bride belonged to her father. The next, she belonged entirely to her husband. And the transfer was not gentle. The ceremony earlier that day had been filled with symbols meant to disguise the truth. She had been torn from her mother's arms in a mock struggle, an echo of Rome's legendary past, when the city's founders had seized Sabine women by force. The guests had laughed at the performance, pretending it was tradition, pretending it was theater. But the tearing was real. Roman writers later described it as symbolic. The women who lived it knew better. As the household slaves approached, their eyes lowered, their steps careful, the bride's heart pounded so loudly she feared it could be heard through the walls. These were women who had prepared brides before her. Women who had washed blood from sheets. Women who never asked questions. They led her to the bedchamber, the lectus genialis, where the marriage would be completed not with tenderness, but with proof. In Rome, a marriage was not truly valid until the wedding night ended. Until that moment, a bride existed in a fragile state between households, between identities. The law demanded certainty. The husband demanded dominance. Society demanded silence. The door closed behind her. The room smelled of oil, incense, and crushed flowers. Laurel branches hung above the bed. The bed itself was high, framed with carved wood depicting gods who watched without mercy. She noticed how the mattress was covered with clean white linens, too white, as if waiting to be marked. Outside, a small group of men lingered near the doorway, pretending to joke, pretending not to listen. In some households, witnesses waited. Not to see, but to hear. Proof mattered more than privacy. Her husband entered last. He did not smile. This was not cruelty born of hatred. It was worse. It was custom. He had been taught that this night was not about mutual union, but about establishing control. Roman moralists wrote openly that a wife must learn fear before she could learn obedience. And fear was the lesson of the wedding night. The ritual demanded resistance. A bride who did not resist was viewed with suspicion. Resistance proved virtue. Tears proved purity. Pain proved legitimacy. The paradox was cruel. She had to fight enough to demonstrate modesty, but not enough to offend. Failure in either direction carried consequences. If she resisted too little, she was branded immoral. If she resisted too much, she risked punishment. The law was on his side. Roman jurists debated property rights, inheritance, and citizenship with great precision, but said almost nothing about the bride's experience. Her body was the final seal on the contract, not a subject worthy of commentary. When the night ended, the linens would speak for her. At dawn, a slave would carry the sheets away. In some households, they were shown discreetly to female relatives. In others, they were silently washed and destroyed. Either way, the evidence mattered more than the woman. What happened in that room was never described in detail, not by historians, not by poets, not by lawmakers. Not because it was rare, but because it was normal. Roman men prided themselves on discipline and order. Yet beneath the marble statues and legal codes was a society that believed dominance was the foundation of stability. The wedding night was not an exception to that belief. It was its purest expression. The bride emerged the next morning no longer a daughter, no longer herself. She was a wife. And Rome expected her to be grateful. The silence surrounding the Roman wedding night was not accidental. It was engineered. For centuries, Roman historians meticulously documented battles, betrayals, political scandals, and imperial excess. They described executions in detail. They recorded massacres without flinching. Yet when it came to the wedding chamber, the place where half of Rome's population was initiated into adulthood, the record went quiet. This was not modesty. It was strategy. Because if Rome had spoken openly about what happened on that night, it would have exposed a contradiction at the heart of the empire, a civilization that claimed moral superiority while institutionalizing fear within its most intimate bond. The Roman family, the familia, was the foundation of the state. At its head stood the paterfamilias, a man granted near absolute authority over everyone beneath his roof, wives, children, slaves. His power was legal, social, and sacred. The wedding night was where that power became real. Roman philosophers argued that order required hierarchy. That hierarchy required submission. And submission, they believed, had to be taught early and decisively. The bride's first night was framed as a necessary shock, a breaking in, disguised as tradition. But there was a problem. Rome also idealized the image of the virtuous matron, loyal, dignified, morally pure. She was celebrated in statues, praised in funeral speeches, and held up as the symbol of Roman civilization itself. To reconcile these two ideas, the brutal initiation and the idealized wife, Rome chose silence. Women were expected to forget. Men were expected not to speak. And historians, almost all male, saw no reason to ask questions that threatened the narrative of Roman greatness. Yet the cracks remain. Legal texts reveal that brides were often very young. Letters hint at fear and dread before marriage. Medical writings discuss injuries suffered by newly married women without explanation. Poets reference wedding nights with dark humor and double meanings that only insiders would understand. Christian writers, centuries later, condemned Roman marriage customs as cruel and inhuman, suggesting that what they saw shocked even a brutal age. Over time, the empire fell. Religions changed. Laws evolved. The rituals faded, not because they were outlawed, but because they were absorbed into quieter, less visible forms. The silence endured. Modern history textbooks mention Roman weddings as colorful ceremonies filled with torches, chants, and symbolic games. The darker half is reduced to footnotes, or erased entirely. But history is not only what is written. It is also what is deliberately forgotten. The Roman wedding night ritual was silenced because it worked. It shaped generations of women into obedience. It reinforced male authority without rebellion. It trained society to accept domination as tradition. And traditions that benefit power are rarely questioned. Today, we like to imagine ourselves far removed from such customs. Yet echoes remain, in expectations, in language, in the idea that suffering is a necessary passage into womanhood. The Romans understood something unsettling: control is most effective when it is ritualized, celebrated, and never discussed. That is why they buried the truth. And why, 2,000 years later, it still feels dangerous to uncover it.